Hello, Bob, Corinne, Helen. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we celebrate the poetry of C.K. Williams with a reading from his collected poems. This was Bob Beitcher's idea, and he has chosen a superb group of Williams poems for us to read. C.K. Williams was born in 1936 in Newark, New Jersey, and died in 2015 in Hopewell, New Jersey. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. He taught at UC Irvine, Columbia, and from 1966-2015, he taught at Princeton. Bob's alma mater, I believe, was University of Pennsylvania, where he got his BA in Lit. And to continue with Williams, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for his book Repair, 1999, C.K. Williams had 24 poetry books published, 2 posthumously. The first thing I think about C.K. Williams is his long line. He has extended the poetic line almost to prose. He has a tremendously large range and depth. He has a compelling narrative. C.K. Williams' poems explore man's inner life. They're relatable. He sees tenderness in the darkness. He's prophetic at times. Loss, which you'll hear, is a prayer almost beckoning. In being alone, he wrote, quote, "Whatever flower of your house should bloom, I will stay, locked to its breast," end of quote. He ends, "A man who has understood and does not," end of quote. A poem very modern in its empathy and ambiguity. His poetry can often be uncanny and ethereal. It can also contain ordinary things, personal relationships, black humor. His poetry is emotional. He uses the particular, as all good poets do. His vision is of the here and now. There's compassion, disgust, a use of complex emotions, but always human. His poetry can also be cool and detached. On learning of a friend's illness, he uses an objective correlative to talk about morality via a herd of horses and ends, quote, "The horses nowhere to be seen, the old one plodding wearily away to join them, the river bitter to look at, and the passionless earth, and the grasses rushing ceaselessly in place," end of quote. His poems are, quote, "cracked open, not open bones," as he wrote in Cave. Cave ends, a gust of upgroaning ardor, flurries of sad meditation, nostalgia for so much already lost, in a stumble of uncountable syllables spun from pulse and passion, something sings and I sing, end of quote. In droplets, he's aware of each moment, quote, a layering of instants, end of quote. He sang, we speak, sing his work today in honor of his brilliance. Here's Bob Beitcher.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Because we're running a little late, I'm going to keep my piece very short. I want to say that C.K. Williams is a very special poet to me because I was introduced to his work by a very dear friend of mine, Anthony Minghella, who passed away way too young, a brilliant writer, director. I'm sure you know him from The English Patient, The Talented Mr. Ripley, and other fine movies. And for Christmas one year, Anthony gave me selected poems of C.K. Williams with a lovely introduction to it. And it's one of the books that I most prize in my library. And over the years, I've read Williams' poetry and learned to really admire it and enjoy it. So I'm going to start off with the first poem, if that's okay, Harry?
Yes.
Okay. In there. Here I am, walking along your eyelid again toward your tear duct. Here are your eyelashes like elephant grass, and one tear blocking the way like a boulder. It probably takes me a long time to figure it out, chatting with neighbors, trying penicillin, steam baths, meditation on the Shekinah, and sonnet cycles. And then 6 more months blasting with my jackhammer before I get in there and can wander through your face meeting you on the sly, kissing you from this side. I am your personal verb now. Here I come, dancing, loving, making poems. I find a telescope and an old astronomer to study my own face with. And then, well, I'm dreaming behind your cheekbone about Bolivia and tangerines and the country. And here I come again along your eyelid, walking. Loss. In this day and age, Lord, you're like one of those poor farmers who burns the forests off and murders his land and then can't leave and goes sullen and lean among the rusting yard junk, the scrub and the famished stock. Lord, I have felt myself raked into the earth like manure, harrowed and plowed under. But I am still enough like you to stand on the porch chewing a stalk or drinking while tall weeds come up dead and the house dogs, snapping their chains like moths, howl and point towards the withering meadows at nothing. Dimensions. There is a world somewhere else that is unendurable. Those who live in it are helpless in the hands of elements. They are like branches in the deep woods and wind that whip their leaves off and slice the heart of the night and sob. They are like boats bleeding wearily in fog. But here, no matter what, we know where we stand. We know more or less what comes next. We hold out. Sometimes a dream will shake us like little dogs. A fever hang on so we're not ourselves, or love wring us out, but we prevail. We certify and make sure we go on. There is a world that uses its soldiers and widows for flour, its orphans for building stone, its legs for pens. In that place, eyes are softened and harmless like gods, and all blend in the traffic of their tragedy and pass by like people. And sometimes one of us, losing the way, will drift over the border and see them there, dying, laughing, being revived. When we come home, we are halfway. Our screams heal the torn silence. We are the scars.
Being alone. Never on one single poor eternity have I been touched by your snows, or felt your shy mouth tremble, your breath break on me like the white wave. I have not felt your nakedness tear me with hunger, or your silver hands betray me. But today I promise, whatever flower of your house shall bloom, I will stay locked to its breast, like little fish who live harmlessly under the bellies of sharks. I will go where you go, drift inconspicuously in the raw dredge of your power, like a leaf, a bubble of carrion, a man who has understood and does not. Giving it up. It is an age of such bestial death that even before we die, our ghosts go. I have felt mine while I slept send shoots over my face, probing some future char there, tasting the flesh and the sweat as though for the last time. And I have felt him extricate himself and go, crying, softening himself and matching his shape to new bodies, merging, sliding into souls, into motors, buildings, stop signs, policemen, anything. By morning, he is back, diminished, shorn of his light. He lies crumbled in my palm, shivering under my breath like cellophane. And every day there is nothing to do but swallow him like a cold tear and get on with it.
the spirit, the triumph. Do you remember learning to tie your shoes? Astonishing. The loops you had to make, the delicate adjustments, the pulling through, tightening, impossible. The things we learn. Putting a bridle on a horse when he's head shy. Getting your hands under a girl's sweater. No wonder we are the crown of all that exists. We can do anything. How we climb chimneys, how we put one foot on the gas and one on the clutch and make the car go. Nothing too difficult, nothing. Crutches, artificial arms. Have you seen that? How they pick up their cups and use razors? Amazing. And the wives, shine it for them at night. They're sleeping. And the wives take it out of the room and polish it with its own special rag. It's late. They hold it against their bellies. The leather laces dangle into their laps. The mechanisms slip noiselessly, lowering the hook softly onto their breasts. We men, aren't we something? I mean, we are worth thinking about, aren't we? We are the end. We are the living end.
Play out of silence. Chances are we will sink quietly back into oblivion without a ripple. We will go back into the face, down through the mortars as though it hadn't happened. Earth, I'll remember you. You were the mother you made pain. I'll grind my thorax against you for the last time and put my hand on you again to comfort you. Sky, could we forget? We were the same as you were. We couldn't wait to get back sleeping. We'd have done anything to be sleeping. And trees, angels for being thrust up here, and stones for cracking in my bare hands, because you foreknew there was no vengeance for being here. When we were flesh, we were eaten. When we were metal, we were burned back. There was no death anywhere but now. When we were men, we became it. Bread. A whole section of the city I live in has been urban renewed, some of it torn down, some restored to what it was supposed to have been a few hundred years ago. Once you could have walked blocks without hearing English. Now the ghettos have been cleared. There are parks and walkways, and the houses are all owned by people who've moved back from the suburbs. When I lived there, at the very edge of it, where the expressway is going in now, and the buildings are still boarded with plywood or flattened altogether, the old market was already shuttered. The shipping depots had been relocated upriver, and the only person I ever saw was a grocer who lived across from me over his empty store. I couldn't understand what he was doing there. It must have been years since a customer had come in, past the dead register and the icebox propped open with a carton, but it was something to have him. He'd make his bed, sweep, cook for himself like a little wife, and when the constables came every week or so to tell him we were condemned, he never paid any attention, so I didn't either. I didn't want to leave. I'd been in love. I thought I was healing. For all I know, I might have stayed forever in the grim room I was camped in. But one day, some boys who must have climbed up through one of the abandoned tenements suddenly appeared skidding and wrestling over the steep pitch of the old man's roof. And when I shouted them to get the hell off, he must have thought I'd meant him. He lurched in his bed and stopped rubbing himself with a white cream he used to use on his breasts. He looked up. Our eyes met. And I think for the first time, he really believed I was there. I don't know how long we stared at each other. I could hear the kid shrieking at me and the road building equipment that had just started tearing the skin from the avenue. Then his zinsy fingers slowly subsided against his heart, and he smiled. A brilliant, total, incongruous smile And even though I had no desire to, the way afterwards I had no desire to cry when my children were born, that did, sob, broke down with joy or some inadmissible apprehension, I smiled back. It was as though we were lovers, as though we'd make speech again and were listening as it gutted and fixed the space between us. And then a violent, almost physical loathing took me for all I'd done to have ended in this place, to myself, to the whole business we've given the name life for. I could go on with this. I could call it a victory, an exemplary triumph, but I'd lie. Sometimes the universe inside us can assume the aspect of places we've been, so that instead of emotions, we see trees we knew or touched or a path. Instead of the face of the thought, there'll be an unmade bed, a car nosing from the alley. All I know about that time is that it stayed. That something, pain or the fear of it, makes me stop the wheel and reach to the silence beyond my eyes, and it's still there. The empty wind, the white crosses of the renewer slashed on the doorposts, the last dim layers of paint loosening from the rotted sills, drifting down.
Friends. My friend Dave knew a famous writer who used to have screwdrivers for breakfast. He'd start with half gin and half juice, and the rest of the day he'd sit with the same glass in the same chair and add gin. The drink would get paler and paler. Finally, he'd pass out. Every day was the same. Sometimes when I'm making milk for the baby, cutting the thick, sweet formula from the can with sterilized water, the baby, hungry again, still hungry, rattling his rickety, long-legged chair with impatience, I think of that story. Dave says the writer could talk like a god. He'd go on for hours in the same thought. In his books, though, you'd never find out why he drove so hard toward his death. I have a death in my memory that lately the word itself always brings back. I'm not sure quite why. A butterfly, during a downpour one afternoon, hooked onto my screen. I thought it was just waiting. The light was just so. Its eyes caught the flare, so it seemed to be watching me in my bed. When I got up to come closer, and it should have been frightened, it hung on. After the rain, it was still there. Its eyes were still shining. I touched the screen, and it fell to the ledge. There were blue streaks on its wings. A while later, the wind took it. The writer drowned in his puke or his liver exploded. It depends on the story. He was a strong man for all that. He must have thought it was taking forever. Dave says when he'd awake with amnesia, he'd want you to fill in the gaps. He just wanted his gin and his juice. From all that you hear, he was probably right. When we were young and we'd drink our minds to extinction, that was the best part. You did this, you said that. It was like hearing yourself in a story. Sometimes real life is almost the same, as though you were being recited. You can almost tell what a thought is before it arrives. When I follow my mind now, another butterfly happens. It's not hard to see why. It's the country this time. The butterfly walked over the white table and onto my hands. I lifted it, and it held. My friends were amazed. Catherine tried too, but the butterfly fluttered away. I put my hand back in the air, and it found me again. It came down on a finger and clung. Its sails lifted. I could see it untwirling the barb of its tongue on my nail. I shook it away. Those were the days and the nights when Catherine and I were first falling in love. Sometimes in the dark, I'd still be afraid, but she'd touch my arm and I'd sleep. The visions I had then were all death. They were hideous and absurd and had nothing to do with my life. All I feel now about death is a sadness, not to be here with everyone I love. But in those dreams, I dream I'd be racked. Catherine would have to reach over to hold me. In the morning it would be better. Even at dawn, when I'd wake first, trembling, grasping for air, I'd burrow back down. Catherine would open her eyes, smiling, with me at her breast, and it would be better.
On learning of a friend's illness, for James Wright, the morning is so gray that the grass is gray, and the side of the white horse grazing is as gray and hard as the harsh, insistent wind gnawing the iron surface of the river. While far off on the other shore, the eruptions from the city seem for once more docile and benign than the cover of nearly indistinguishable clouds they unfurl to insinuate themselves among. It's a long while since the issues of mortality have taken me this way. Shivering, I tramped the thin, bitten track to the first rise, the first descent, and toiling up again, I startle out of their brushy hollow the whole herd of wild-eyed, shaggy, unkempt mares, their necks, rumps, withers, even faces begrimed with patches of the gluey alluvial mud. All of them at once, their nostrils flared, their tails flung up over their backs like flags, are suddenly in flight, plunging and shoving along the narrow furrow of the flood ditch, bursting from its mouth, charging headlong towards the wires at the pasture's end, banking finally like one great graceful wing to scatter down the hillside out of sight. Only the oldest of them all stays with me, and she, sway-backed over at the knees, blind, most likely deaf, still when I approach her, swings her meager backside to me, her ears flattening, the imperturbable opals of her eyes gazing resolutely over the bare, scruffy fields, the scattered pines and strands of third growth oak I called a forest once. I slip up on her, hook her narrow neck, haul her to me, hold her for a moment, let her go. I hardly can remember anymore what there ever was out here that keeps me coming back to watch the land be amputated by freeways and developments, and the mares in their sanctuary thinning out, reverting, becoming less and less approachable, more and more the symbols of themselves. Oh, how cold it is. The hoofprints in the hardened muck are frozen lakes, their rims atilt, their gazed opacities skewered with straw, muddled with the ancient ubiquitous manure. I pick a morsel of it up, scentless, harmless, cool, as desiccated as an empty hive. It crumbles in my hand, its weightless, wingless filaments taken from me by the wind and strewn in a long, surprising arc that wavers once, then seems to burst into a rain of dust. No comfort here. Nothing to say, to try to say. Nothing for anyone. I start the long trek back. The horse is nowhere to be seen, the old one plodding wearily away to join them, the river bitter to look at, and the passionless earth and the grasses rushing ceaselessly in place.
Mistress, after the drink, after dinner, after the half-hour idiot kids cartoon special on the TV, after undressing his daughter, mauling at the miniature buttons on the back of her dress, the games on the bed, "Look at my pee-pee," she says, pulling her thighs wide. "Isn't it pretty?" After the bath, pajamas, the song, and the kiss, and the telling his wife, it's her turn now. Out now, at last, out of the house to make the call. Out to take a stroll, this evening's lie. He finds the only public phone booth in the neighborhood's been savage. Receiver torn away, wires thrust back up the coin slot to its innards. And he stands there. What else? What now? And notices he's panting. He's panting like an animal. He's breathing like a bloody beast. The lover. When she stopped by, just passing on her way back from picking up the kids at school, taking them to dance, it just happened by the business her husband owned and her lover worked in. Their glances, hers and her lover's, that is, not the husband's, seemed so decorous, so distant, barely, just barely touching their fiery wings, their clanging, she thought, so well muffled, that later in the filthy women's bathroom in the stall, she was horrified to hear two typists coming from the office laughing about them, all of them. Their boss, her husband, the blind pig, one said, and laughed, and her, the horny bitch, the other said, and they both laughed again. And him, did you see him? That sanctimonious lying bastard? I thought he was going to blush. Thinking thought. Oh, soul, I sometimes, often, still say when I'm trying to convince my inner self of something. Oh, soul, I say still, there's so much to be done. Don't want to stop to rest now, not already. Oh, soul, I say, the implications of the task are clear. Why procrastinate? Why whine? All the while I know my struggle has to do with mind being only sometimes subject to the will, that other portion of itself which manages to stay so recalcitrantly, obstinately impotent. Oh, soul, come into my field of want, my realm of act, be attentive to my computations and predictions. But as usual, soul resists. As usual, soul retires. As usual, soul's old act of dissipation and removal. Oh, the furious, elusive unities of want, the frail, false fusions and discursive chains of hope. Jews. She could tell immediately, she said, that he was Jewish, although he didn't, of course, look it. It was his seriousness. And she wanted to take the opportunity, because she met so few these days, to ask him some questions about the vision a Jew would have of some of the unfortunate attitudes she felt were being promulgated. Oh, Lord, again, in this terribly provincial, conservative country. She'd been a leftist in the old days, when it was still worth being one. She'd admired Jews then, and still did. They were so much more aware of subtleties, of implications in the apparently innocuous. Here, for instance, the old anti-Semitism, little explicit, little said in public, but people like us, sensitive to that sort of thing, surely we knew. Couldn't he sense it just in the tone of things.
Cave. Not yet a poet, not yet a person perhaps, or a human, or not so far as I'd know now. I lurk in the lobe of a cave, before me sky, a tangle of branch, a tree I can't name. Not yet in a myth, tale, history, chronicle of a race or a race. I don't know if I speak, and if I do speak, I don't know if I pray. To what pray? Or if I sing, do I dare sing? Who would be with me? Would there be indication of household past the scatter of seed, the cracked open, not open bones that would have to have been to sustain me? Cold, cold ending, rain rising and ending, ever menacing night circling towards me. Might I dream, at least, singing, toneless nearly, 2 notes or 3, modeless but singing? Not yet in a garden of morality or of mind, not yet in the shimmering prisms of reflection. There must still be past the prattle and haggle of breath some aspiration to propel me, a gust of upgroaning ardor, flurries of sad meditation, nostalgia for so much already lost, and a stumble of uncountable syllables spun from pulse and passion. Something sings, and I sing. Droplets. Even when the rain falls relatively hard, only one leaf at a time of the little tree you planted on the balcony last year, then another leaf at its time, and one more is set trembling by the constant droplets. But the rain, the clouds flocked over the city, you at the piano inside, your hesitant music mingling with the din of the downpour, the gush of rivulets loosed from the eaves, the iron railings and flowing gutters. All of it fuses in me with such intensity that I can't help wondering why my longing to live forever has so abated that it hardly comes to me anymore, and never as it did, as regret for what I might not live to live, but rather as a layering of instants like this, transient as the mist drawn from the rooftops, yet emphatic as any note of the nocturne. You practice, and the storm faltering, fading into its own radiant passing, you practice again.
Risk. Difficult to know whether humans are inordinately anxious about crisis, calamity, disaster, or unknowingly crave them. These horrific conditionals, these expected unexpecteds, we dwell on them, flinch, faint, steel ourselves. But mightn't our forebodings actually precede anxiety? Isn't so much sheer heedfulness emblematic of desire? How do we come to believe that wrenching ourselves to attention is the most effective way for dealing with intimations of catastrophe? Consciousness a tremble. What makes it so not be the fear of what the future might or might not bring, but the wish for fear, for concentration, vigilance, as though life were more convincing, resonating like a blade. Of course, we're rarely swept into events other than domestic tumult, from which awful consequences will ensue. Fortunately, rarely. And yet we sweat as fervently for the most insipid issues of honor and unrealized ambition. Lost brothership, lost lust. We engorge our little sorrows, beat our drums, perform our dances of aversion. Always, these gigantic inconceivables, always, what will have been done to me? And so we don our mental armor, flex, thrill, pay the strict attention we always knew we should. A violent alertness, the muscularity of risk, though still the secret inward cry. What else? What more?
Dance. A middle-aged woman, quite plain to be polite about, and somewhat stout to be more courteous still. But when she and the rather good-looking, much younger man she's with get up to dance, her forearm descends with such delicate lightness, such restrained but confident ardor athwart his shoulder, drawing him to her with such a firm, compelling warmth, and moving him with effortless grace into the union she's instantly established with the not at all rhythmically solid music in this second-rate cafe. That something in the rest of us, some doubt about ourselves, some sad conjecture seems to be allayed. Nothing that we'd ever thought of as a real lack, and nothing not to be admired or be repentant for, but something to which we've never adequately given credence, which might have consoling implications about how we misbelieve ourselves, and so the world. That world beyond us, which so often disappoints, but which sometimes shows us lovely what we are.
Dirt. My grandmother is washing my mouth out with soap. Half a long century gone, and still she comes at me with that thick, cruel yellow bar. All because of a word I said. Not even said, really, only repeated, but open, she says, open up, her hand clawing at my head. I know now her life was hard. She lost 3 daughters as babies. Then her husband died too, leaving young sons and no money. She'd stand me in the sink to pee because there was never room in the toilet. But oh, her soap. Might its bitter burning have been what made me a poet? The street she lived on was unpaved, her flat, 2 cramped rooms, and a fetid kitchen where she stalked and caught me. Dare I admit that after she did it, I never really loved her again. She lived to 100 even then. All along it was the sadness, the squalor, but I never, until now, loved her again. Bialystok, or Lvov, a squalid wayside inn, barn-brewed vodka, corn husk cigarettes that cloy like acrid incense in a village church, kegs of rotten watered wine. But then a prayer book's worn thin pages, and over them, as though afloat in all that fetidness, my great-grandfather's disembodied head. Cacophonous drunkenness, lakes of vomit, and oceans of obscenities, the smallpox-pocked salacious peasant faces, whose carious breath clots one's own, and violence, the scorpion brutal violence of nothing else to do, to have. Then the prayers again, that tormented face, its shattered gaze, and that's all I have of whence I came, of where the blood came from that made my blood. And the tale's not even mine. I have it from a poet, the Russian Jewish, then Israeli Bialik. And from my father, speaking of his father's father dying in his miserable tavern, in a fight, my father said, with berserk Cossacks, but my father fabulated, so I omit all that and share the poet's forebears, because mine only wanted to forget their past of poverty and pogrom, so said nothing, or perhaps where someone came from, a lost name, otherwise nothing, leaving me less history than a dog, just the poet's fathers and my great-grandfather's inn, that sty, the poet called it, that abyss of silence, I'd say, and that soul like snow, the poet wrote, with tears of blood, I'd add, for me and mine.
Lessons. When I offered to help her and took the arm of the young blind woman standing seemingly bewildered on my corner, she thanked me, disengaged my hand, and tucked one of hers under my elbow with a forthright, somehow heartening firmness. We walked a few blocks to the subway and rode a while in the same direction. She studied history, she told me. Then there was my stop. That's all there was time for. Something about feeling the world come towards her in irrational jags, 100 voices a minute, honks, squeals, the clicking blur of a bike, and how she let herself flow across it with the most valiant, unflinching unsurprise. Made the way I dwell on my own cognition, the junctures of perception and thought, seem suddenly hectic, blunt. The sense of abundance is squandered and misused. My first piano teacher was partially blind. Her sister, with whom she lived, was entirely so. She had a guide dog, a shepherd, who'd snarl at me from their yard. I feared him nearly as much as the teacher. She, of the old school, cool and severe, because of her sight, would seem to scowl at my fingers, and she kept a baton on the keyboard to rap them for their inexhaustible store of wrong notes, and for lags of my always inadequate attention. Still, to bring her back just to berate her is unfair. I mustn't have been easy either. I keep being drawn to that place, though. There was some scent there, some perfume, some powder. My ears would ring and my eyes widen, tear. Rank, wild, may have been perspiration. They were poor. Or old music, or books. 2 women, a dog. Despite myself, stumbling out into the dusk, dear dusk, I'd find myself trying to breathe it again. And the way one can find oneself strewn so inattentively across life, across time, those who touch us, those whom we touch, we hold them or we let them go, as though it were such a small matter. How even know in truth how much of mine should be memory? No less what portion of self should be others rather than self. Across life, across time, as though it were such a small matter.
Oh. Oh my, Harold Brodke, of all people, after all this time appearing to me, so long after his death, so even longer since our friendship, our last friendship, the 3rd or 4th, the one anyway when the ties between us definitively frayed. Oh, Harold's a handful, another of his ex-friends sympathized to my relief. Harold Brodke, at a Christmas Eve dinner of all times and places, because of my nephew's broken nose of all reasons, which he suffered in an assault, the bone shattered, reassembled, but healing a bit out of plumb. And when I saw him, something Harold wrote came to mind about Marlon Brando, how until Brando's nose was broken, he'd been pretty, but after he was beautiful. And that's the case here. a sensitive boy, now a complicatedly handsome young man with a sinewy edge he hadn't had, which I surely remarked because of Harold. And if I spoke to the dead, which I don't, or not often, I might thank him. It's pleasant to think of you, Harold, of our good letters and talks. I'm sorry we didn't make up that last time. I wanted to, but I was worn out by your snits and rages, your mania to be unlike and greater than anyone else, your preemptive attacks for inadequate acknowledgement of your genius. But no, leave it alone. Harold's gone, truly gone. And isn't it unforgivable, vile to stop loving someone or to stop being loved? We don't mean to lose friends, but someone drifts off and we let them, or we renounce us, or we them, or we're hurt like flowers, for God's sake, when really we're prideful brutes, as blunt as icebergs. Until something like this, some Harold Brocky wandering into your mind as exasperating as ever, and oh my, as brilliant, as charming, unwound from his web to confront you with how ridden you are with unthought regret, how diminished, how well you know you'll clunk on to the next rationalization, the next loss, the next lie.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Corinne. Thank you, Helen. Magnificent readings. We have 3 minutes left. Would each one of you like to take about a minute to say something about Williams's writing, starting with you, Bob?
Well, Harry, rather than say something about his writings, I just want to say what an incredible privilege it is to hear Williams's poems read by the three of you. Oh. Each of you in a different style, but so magnificent, so moving, so digging into the essence of his writing and understanding it and magnifying it. It's just, for me, a lover of his work, but always hearing it in my own head and my own mind and reading. It's just such a pleasure to hear it in your voices. So thank you very much.
Helen, you want to say something, please?
I was in each of the poems except one. I was looking in a way for the metaphor because the title of the poem, sometimes it didn't quite match what was going on then, but then I found it and I realized that I was able to put what I was supposed to into the poem, but the one that didn't need any that kind of interpretation was my favorite, which is Dirt, because that yellow soap bar, I remember, although I washed my mouth out with, but to get the cooties out of my hair.
Corinne?
Well, I would thank Bob for bringing us to C.K. Williams, because really, I felt as though he really spoke to me somehow. I laughed and cried just reading his stuff. And he definitely was, this is a poet that really got to me. And speaking about Dirt, Helen, that poem, that exact came up to my mother when I asked her what the F word meant. She said, no such word. And if I hear you say it again, I'll wash your mouth out with soap. So I like that poem too.
It's an honor, and I agree that Bob, brought some wonderful poems to us. And the guy has such a range, CKW, and he also has the ability to talk about people without being petty. Somehow his use of language just lifts it up, and then he can cut things loose and move on. It really has such an extraordinary narrative. So this has really been a treat. And I would just say what Bob said, I would say the same thing. It's mutual. I feel honored to hear all of you read, and it really is a wealth. And it, takes me to church I'm educated every time I do one of these. And I see it's 1 minute to 2. And as they say, TV waits for no man or no woman. So I'm going to turn this over after thanking you all once again, and turn this over to Jennifer Clymer.
Harry, thank you as always for bringing us together for this purpose.